Right, ladies and gentlemen, very good morning from Dhaka, Bangladesh. This is S.M. Masoom Billah, Associate Professor of Law, Jagannath University, and I am the moderator of this session titled Remembering the Genocide 50 Years Later. And we are hosting this session as a part of the Liberation War Museum Global Conference on commemorating past genocides and learning to prevent atrocity crimes. In this conference, in several sessions, this topic will be covered as well. This is the month of March in Bangladesh, and it is also important. This is the month of independence in Bangladesh. On 26th March, Bangladesh emerged as an independent country in the map of the world. And 25th March is one of the darkest days in our national life when genocide did take place here. And if we look at also the international plane, the trend has not stopped yet. We see cases going on at the ICJ on the failure of Myanmar's Genocide Convention obligation. Also, ICC investigation is going on about the possibility of occurring a genocide in Rakhine State. So that is what is happening all around. This particular session is looking at Bangladesh's genocide trial and also its other experiences from international perspectives. We have three distinguished panelists here. First of all, I would like to introduce Professor Emeritus Rafiqul Islam, who needs no introduction. Actually, first ever Bengali professor to be adorned with this such an professorship. Professor Islam has authored on international law areas on various issues, including genocide, war crimes, trade law, refugee law, and many more. So welcome, Professor Rafiqul Islam, to this session. Sir, can you hear me? Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, I can hear you. Sir, welcome to this session. I would like to introduce two other panelists. We have got Patrick Verses, international human rights expert, and also president of Asia Justice and Rights. He has also worked with UN Peacekeeping Mission in Timor-Leste and many more. Patrick, you have been a very good friend of Bangladesh for a long time. Thank you very much for joining us, Patrick. Can you hear me?
Thank you very much for inviting me. Yes, I have been a very good friend and will continue to be a very good friend of Bangladesh.
Thank you. Thank you. We have the another panelist, Samuel Jaffe, if I pronounce your name correctly, an independent scholar based in New Zealand. Well, Samuel has studied in Columbia and London School of Economics, and he has worked on Bangladesh's international response to Bangladesh Liberation War. He has a book waiting to be published from UPL this year. Samuel, welcome to this session, and thank you so very much for joining us. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Now, we have this on hour or lace. I will humbly request all the speakers to confine within the time 10 to 15 minutes. And once you have finished your presentation, we will make the session open for the audience so that we can entertain some questions. And I request the audience to leave the questions in the chat box as well so that we can receive it and also can place it on the table for discussion. Very first of all, I would like to humbly request Emeritus Professor Rafiqul Islam to deliver his speech. Professor Islam will be speaking on genocide trials in Bangladesh and some of its interpretation. Up to you, sir.
Thank you, Masoom. Given the time limit, I would be extremely brief. It would be a kind of overview of what the Bangladesh International Crimes Tribunal have been interpreting various aspects of genocide charges before it. I will touch upon some of the striking points that may be different or similar to international trial. I'll begin with the definitional characteristics. Basically, if you look at the 1973 Act, it's largely reproduction of the Nuremberg Charter. As a result, most of its definitional aspects comply with that. And subsequently, if you look at Article 2 of the Genocide Convention and Article 6 of the International Criminal Rome Statute Convention, there is only one difference, basically, in my view, and that is Bangladesh has included political groups in addition to national, ethnic, religious, all these kinds of traditional groups. Bangladesh has added one more, is political group. And the reason is that this inclusion reflects the unique situation in Bangladesh. And of course, if you look at the drafting history of the Genocide Convention's Article 2, the definition, in fact, Genocide Convention, draft convention formulated in 1946. In fact, the drafting history shows that certain component of the extent of the draft were purposefully weakened in the final draft text. The political group, along with cultural genocide and universal jurisdiction, among others, were dropped for the sake of securing consensus. Moreover, there is nothing in the legislative history of the Genocide Convention to suggest that its member states are prevented from expanding the ambit of the definition of genocide in their domestic legislation. Bangladesh experienced genocidal carnage engineered and executed to further the political ideology of Pakistan and pro-Pakistani political parties in 1971. Given the enlargement of the ambit of the definition of genocide, the inclusion of political group in the definition of genocide in the 1973 Act bears contextual merit and does not appear to be inconsistent with international law prohibiting genocide in all its forms and manifestation. Towards the end of, in various interpretations, one thing I shall try to highlight that both tribunals kept on relying on the contextual aspects of genocide, especially the mass killing of the Hindus as the target group. So here lies the significance of political context of the commission of genocide, crimes of genocide in Bangladesh. So that's basically would be reflecting, that's a kind of unique directions that Bangladesh tribunal, both tribunals have adopted. Now, the 1973 Act combines just traditional two elements of genocide. The physical commission of genocidal act, what is actus reus, and the mental intent, mens rea, to commit genocide. Bangladesh 1973 Act also subscribed to this. And both tribunal interpreted that in a contextual aspect. Acts of physical or biological destruction of a target group are the prima facie evidence of genocide, which become conclusive if carried out with the intent of achieving the destruction of the group in whole or in part. I'm sure you people are familiar with the definition in Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. It is in this sense that genocide is an intentional crime. Intention is the essence of the essential characteristics of genocide, which distinguishes it from other serious crimes. While it is comparatively easier to prove the physical perpetration of genocidal act factually, its specific intent to destroy a target group in whole or in part is the hardest requirement to prove before any court of law. Recently, if I cite two similar genocide charge cases by International Court of Justice, one is Croatia versus Serbia, and the other one is Bosnia and Herzegovina and versus Serbia and Montenegro. One is decided as late as February 3, 2015, and the other is 2007 case. This basically, the International Court of Justice held that there was ample evidence of the physical commission of the violent acts during the Yugoslav conflict, but there was no sufficient evidence to demonstrate the specific intent for the genocidal act. So this specific intent has been a daunting challenge for the prosecutors in Bangladesh to establish it before both tribunals. And if you follow the process, you will find that the prosecution has been extremely cautious not to list genocide as a crime simply because in their charges, simply because it has been easier to prove crimes against humanity rather than crimes of genocide. So they raised crimes of genocide only in exceptional circumstances where there are ample evidence of driving Hindus, internal genocide and ethnic cleansing, things like that, killing them, driving them to India, all kinds of things to topple the majority of the East Pakistan by driving Hindus from East Pakistan to India. So that sort of line the judges took. But even then, the success rate is about 50-60%. In 50-40% cases, they fail to establish these charges. Now I'll highlight some of the issues that the Tribunal 1 I'll take first, International Crimes Tribunal 1 in first. It set a set of standard that needs to be established. In other words, in discharging the burden of proof in genocidal charges, the Tribunal 1 set certain criteria for the prosecution to establish that before the tribunal. I'll highlight some of them. Basically, in holding an accused criminally responsible for committing genocide, the ICT-1 required certain specific standard of proof, which proved to be almost insurmountable for the prosecution in many instances. And you also notice that if you follow this genocide charges trial, you will notice that in case of factual account of commission of killing, mass killing, defense didn't object to that. But the only objection was intentional part to commit genocide. And that was fiercely debated in almost every cases between prosecution and defense. So I'll highlight some of this standard of proof required by ICT-1. That the accused consciously and knowingly accompanied the principal perpetrators. I'm sure you are aware of it, because here principal perpetrators are mostly Pakistan occupation troops and some of their auxiliary forces, Rajakar, Al-Badr, and things like that. And the trial was happening against the local perpetrators, local groups. So that's why it says the accused consciously and knowingly accompanied the principal perpetrators at the crime site. That the accused has an individual and part of the joint enterprise induced, participated, aided, abetted, and substantially contributed to the commission of massacre against a protected civilian group and its normal livelihood amounting to genocide. The third condition, it says that the accused had the knowledge of the intention of the principal perpetrators. Fourth, the accused acted under a common purpose of furthering the perpetration of genocide against a predetermined target group. And this is how tribunal linked it to the Hindu group, Hindu as a religious minority group. Then that the victim are perceived by the accused and principal perpetrators as belonging to the targeted Hindu religious group for its destruction in full or in part was aimed in their planning. And finally, that the victim are targeted not because of their individual identity, but because they belong to the Hindu community. ICT2, while followed this, encountered two different situations, and I'll highlight that it had to decide two contentious issues. The first issue was whether the commission of crime against a limited number of members of the Hindu community in a geographically confined area could be construed as attempts to destroy the Hindu community in whole or in part. This arose in Abul Kalam Azad's case, or the Bachu Rajakar case, the very first one, whereby in a bazaar, in a village, about 3 or 4 Hindu people were killed. Now the issue was whether that small numerical number, 2 or 3, in a particular place constituted an act of genocide, at least prima facie. And the tribunal, what the tribunal held, that the intent of physical destruction may target only a geographically limited part of large number because the perpetrators regard the intended destruction as sufficient to annihilate the group as a distinct identity. And second condition, it says the targeting specific parts of the Hindu community was emblematic of the overall Hindu community in Bangladesh and essential to its survival, which qualified the requirement of substantial for the purpose of inferring the genocidal intention. On both points, basically the tribunal relied on Yugoslav tribunal. It cited the various cases that contribute to these two particular points. The second issue was whether genocidal intent can be inferred in the absence of any confession by the accused or any direct or explicit evidence of such an intent. In deciding in the affirmative, the tribunal too reasoned that the attack against civilian member belonging to the Hindu religious group launched with the aim and intent of perpetrators was to destroy the Hindu group or community in part and qualified as genocidal intent. And the second point, it said the above genocidal intent presupposes that victims are chosen by reason of their membership in the group whose destruction was sought.
Professor Islam, you have 2 minutes.
Yeah, I'll finish it soon. I already highlighted that right from the beginning in 1945, when Pakistan emerged as an independent state from British colonialism, East Pakistan was numerically majority. If you look at the 61 census, it will tell you what was the population at that time. I think about 57 or 6, I think at some stage 61%. Now a bulk of it was Hindu population who was classified as the enemy of Pakistan, not loyal to Pakistan, but loyal to India. So Pakistan pursued a persistent policy of driving Hindus out of East Pakistan to India. And in 71, Hindus are specifically targeted to exterminate, to make, once the Hindu population is gone, East Pakistan would have been minority and West Pakistan would have been majority. So there are various other disparity issues, constitutional issues. I am not going into that, but the gist is that because of East Pakistan's majority was reflected in 1970 election where Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman and his Awami League won the election. In fact, by driving Hindus or killing, exterminating Hindus, there was a concerted political attempt to make East Pakistan minority. And this contextual context has repeatedly been mentioned in most of the judgment in dealing with charges of genocide. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. That's interesting. I'll be interested to get back to that question that about the approach of the ICTBD and to what extent the approach of the ICTBD differs from the approach taken by other international tribunals. But before that, we'll be switching over to another issue to take a transnational justice, transitional justice approach, planting and nursing from the grassroots. And on this issue, we have Patrick Burgess with us to talk on that. Patrick is the president of Asia Justice and Rights. Patrick, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay there?
Yeah.
Okay, great. And thank you very much, Professor. It was very interesting to hear your analysis of the genocide issue. And it's always, before I begin, I work on these issues a lot. It's always very difficult to fulfill the legal elements of the crime of genocide because the crime itself requires a special intent to destroy in whole or in part one of the 4 protected groups. So trying to prove that the perpetrators had the special intent to destroy and not some other political intention is always very difficult. My topic today is to look at transitional justice and link it to the events of 1971 in Bangladesh, and also the big question, what are we learning about how to prevent genocide? And that is very relevant to Bangladesh today, as we see the links, and at this conference in particular, we see the links of the 1971 genocide, massive crimes against humanity committed in Bangladesh with up to 3 million victims. And we see 1 million Rohingya refugees in the eastern part of the country around Cox's Bazar, where my team continues to work. The victims of genocide on the hands of the Myanmar military. And we also have a team in Yangon right now and across Myanmar dealing with the continued acts of the Burmese military, having not been held to account for those actions against the Rohingya. So the lessons that we have in mind are this big question: when mass crimes are committed, whether we classify them as genocide, crimes against humanity, or war crimes, is not so relevant. Each one of those categories are the most terrible crimes that can be committed. The question is, what do we do about them? And this question is really the definition of transitional justice. This term has no magic. It's a term that has increasingly been used since the 1990s in contexts such as Bangladesh, where mass crimes have been committed. And basically, it means, according to the words of the Secretary General of the United Nations, all of the mechanisms and all of the processes that a country employs to deal with a history of mass violations. And those steps that a country takes, and for example, that Bangladesh has taken to deal with the 1971 genocide, and now to try and deal with the genocide committed against the Rohingya, or the crimes against humanity at least, we're faced with these issues. What to do? The transitional justice framework that's used by many of us who work on these contexts has 4 basic elements. And those elements are not, again, prescribed in any holy book or any set text that we have to. It's not in a convention. They're general categories that help us to strategize and implement programs to deal with mass violations. In basic terms, the 4 are prosecuting those who are responsible. And we heard about the 1973 Act in Bangladesh, the ICT trials that have been taking place, the difficulty in charges, genocide, crimes against humanity. This is one category of transitional justice, prosecuting those who are responsible. The second category is uncovering and sharing the truth about what has taken place. This is fundamentally important. And many ask me, which is the most important of the 4 elements? Perhaps it's the truth, because without the truth, how do we know who to prosecute? How do we know who are the victims? And how do we know how to reform? The first element, prosecutions. Also uncovering the truth. The third is repairing the lives of victims, or reparations. And the fourth is undertaking the reforms, both social and institutional, that will provide guarantees that there's not going to be a recurrence. So we have those 4 elements. And if we just take the situation in Bangladesh after 1971, we can have a quick look at what kind of transitional justice work has been done. About 15 years ago, a bit more than 15 years ago, I arrived in Dhaka and I met with Mofidul Haq from the Liberation War Museum, and I began work with him and his team at a dusty little building that was the Liberation War Museum office, an NGO dedicated to the helping victims, uncovering the truth, pushing for accountability and reforms. All of those elements of transitional justice, actually. That dusty little fantastic old office has now become a multi-million-dollar world-class museum in Dhaka dedicated to the human rights struggle and the War of Independence. In that time, when I came to Bangladesh, what shocked me and has shocked many people that I talk with around the world is how little is known about the genocide committed in Bangladesh in 1971. Those of us who are my age might remember George Harrison of the Beatles leading a major world concert on the issue of Bangladesh, recorded a fantastic musical album about it. And that was his effort to raise the profile, to shine a light onto what had happened in Bangladesh. But one of the challenges is, in relation to all of the transitional justice issues, in my view, this big challenge that mass crimes take place in darkness. They really, when the light is shone onto human beings' behavior, when people can see what they're doing, when their families know, their communities know, their country knows, and the world knows what they're doing, they're much less likely to do it and to continue doing it. In the case of Bangladesh, the lights were off, and they haven't really been turned on across the world to tell the world what did take place. For me, one of the hooks, one of the things that helps us to remember what happened in Bangladesh was the crazy policy of the British following World War II, when they decided that this new country of Pakistan would have two parts, East and West, and it would be divided by the country of India, which is more than 3,000 kilometers wide. This is before mobile phones, before Skype and Instagram and Zoom. That, to the simple minds of the British administrators at the time, that made sense. They really weren't understanding that those two peoples had very different cultures, very different religions, very different priorities. And what's interesting is, in relation to the background to the mass crimes that took place in Bangladesh, was that it took place in the aftermath of an election, and a disputed election. And now what we're seeing, have a think about the lessons that we need to learn by shining a light, by learning about elections. We've just seen the Capitol stormed in Washington, D.C. because a president refused to accept the results of an election. In Bangladesh, the Pakistanis refused to receive the results of the election that meant that Bangladesh would become an independent country. In East Timor, where I lived for 6 years, the Indonesian military refused to accept the result of the United Nations ballot that I was part of, and burned 60,000 houses in 3 weeks. And right now in Myanmar, the Burmese military, who their party received less than 3% of the votes in the November election. Aung San Suu Kyi's party received more than 80% of the votes, have taken almost exactly the same claim as Donald Trump and said that the Aung San Suu Kyi's party cheated in the election, so they need to take over. So are we learning the lessons about mass crimes? Is the point of transitional justice? The goals of transitional justice are to use these 4 elements holistically and sequentially in the order that they're possible in a context. It wasn't possible to prosecute for a long time in Bangladesh, for decades. But the victims pushed and pushed and pushed, and eventually it became an election issue of the young people in Bangladesh saying, if you don't agree to hold the perpetrators of the 1971 election violence to account, we won't vote for you. It was the young who pushed for this part of transitional justice, the prosecution, to finally be able to establish a court. Now, that court has had a lot of international criticism about fair trial rights, and I don't have time nor the mandate to look at that here today. But one of the factors which is not often discussed in relation to that is that the victims of those violations had been pushing for decades for some form of accountability. And it's always going to be very difficult for a national tribunal to implement international law, to have national trials in a context where the rule of law is not particularly strong. So they finally did achieve a court. The court is progressing. There are challenges. What about the other 3 elements of this term, transitional justice, that helps us to deal with the mass violations? Have we sought the truth in a broader sense? Has that been uncovered in relation to Bangladesh? Have the victims been assisted? And have the reforms taken place that will help those violations not recur? What I learned working in transitions all across Asia is that in the face of a lack of funding, often a lack of government support, the victims and the human rights defenders that support them will come up with incredibly creative and courageous ways of achieving the transitional justice goals. One of the examples in relation to truth-seeking, the second part of the transitional justice model. Remember, we had the prosecutions, we have the truth-seeking. Reparations for Victims and Reform. We have many examples of truth-seeking. Some of the most famous are the South African Truth Commission. I've worked 3 years full-time on the Timor Truth Commission, and I've been an advisor on a number of others around the world. One of the most outstanding examples of truth-seeking that I share all over the world comes from Bangladesh, from the Liberation War Museum. In a situation where there hasn't been a large official truth commission to uncover all of the stories about what happened in 1971, the Liberation War Museum came up with a very novel program, and they sent out their volunteers and others to many, many schools across the country. And they said to the children, your grandparents are old, they may not be able to tell us their stories for a long time. They were here during the 1971 violations. They remember them. We want you, the children, to take the stories of your grandparents, to write them, go home, talk to them, and write out their stories. Right. Then the LWM helped those schools to take the stories of those children, recording their grandparents' experiences, and bind them into books. So they had something concrete to show for that school, for that group. 60,000 of those stories were gathered. And that is an incredible effort of what we call an unofficial truth-seeking mechanism. You have the official mechanisms like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Human Rights Commission, fact-finding missions, UN commissions. This is an amazing example of an unofficial grassroots transitional justice mechanism. My time is short. There's so much more to talk about. I just want to talk about one more example of a grassroots truth-seeking effort that my organization, Asia Justice and Rights, with the Liberation War Museum, has been involved in the Rohingya camps. We know that hundreds of Rohingya women were terribly violated, mass raped by the Burmese military during the violations 2 years ago. They are now in the camps outside Cox's Bazar. So our team started to work with those women victims in a very confidential way, women only. And they decided to come up with a special form of truth-seeking and truth-sharing. And they've woven their stories into small panels of sewing, showing themselves, showing their trip across the river, showing what happened to them. And we've helped them to put those sewing panels into a quilt. We call it the Quilt of Memory and Hope. Now that quilt, memorizing the experience of those women victims, is going to be used around the world in order to throw that light into the darkness of their experience, to share their stories around the world. And this is just another example. We could talk all day about the examples from Asia, the grassroots examples of the goals of transitional justice, far from the International Criminal Court, far from the northern capitals that are well funded, often undertaken voluntarily and with no support. Programs like the school children putting together their books, programs like the Quilt of Memory and Hope, and this type of work by victims' organizations gives us all inspiration to keep working on these issues. So thank you very much for your time today, and I hope to have an opportunity to talk to you again.
Thank you for raising all those important questions and issues. I'm sure the audience will have questions and comments on that if time permits us later. Now, can I get back to Samuel? Well, Samuel is based in Wellington. He has worked on international response to Bangladesh Liberation War and studied in University of Columbia and London School of Economics. So floor is yours, Samuel.
Very much. Can you see me or can you see my screen?
Yes, I can, yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Well, first of all, thanks very much for having me. Professor Islam and Patrick, very difficult act to follow. I enjoyed both your talks very much, and I'll make reference to them as I'm going along. I come at this from a slightly different perspective. I am a historian by training, and what I hope to do today is just to talk a little bit about one story that arises from some of my work looking at activism on the part of ordinary people in the United States during 1971, during the Liberation War, to raise awareness about what was going on in Bangladesh at that time. So, if I might, this map will be very familiar to many of the people who, or just about anyone who's here today, I'd say. It looks at sort of the geopolitical breakdown of 1971, where we had the United States and China and various other countries supporting Pakistan, and India and the Soviet Union supporting Bangladesh. And we know a lot about that part of the story. We know a lot about these two guys right here, President Nixon and Henry Kissinger, and about their attitudes toward in support of Pakistan. We know, for instance, that you know, through the work of many Bangladeshi scholars and foreign scholars like Gary Bass, how deep that support ran. We know about the degree to which this was reported on, even though, Patrick, as you talked about, you know, mass crimes do take place in darkness, and that certainly was the case, and I'll return to that. There were many journalists who did attempt to penetrate that darkness, including people like Sidney Schanberg as well. We know about Edward Kennedy, who traveled to visit the refugee camps, tried to visit Pakistan, but was denied the opportunity to do that during the war. But what we perhaps don't know quite so much about, and the subject of my research, were sort of the activities of ordinary people overseas, how the world saw this, but not at a geopolitical level, how ordinary people overseas saw this, how they approached the genocide in 1971, and what some of them attempted to do in order to stop it. So the one group that I'm going to talk about today is called the Bangladesh Information Center, several members of whom you see seated here in Lafayette Park, just outside the White House in May of 1971. So this group has its origins in the ICDDRB, at that time called the Pakistan Ceto Cholera Research Laboratory in Moakkali, just up the road, or more or less, from the new Muktijodha Jadughar. Here we see several doctors who from the United States who were associated with that organization, which was doing some really amazing cholera research into infectious diseases and cholera at that time, looking at how to sort of address this most, you know, dangerous and horrible of diseases. But these doctors that came from the United States, they didn't just come by themselves, they came with their families. So here we have the late Candy Rodi, who was married to John Rodi, another doctor at this institution. And the doctors and their families who lived in what was then East Pakistan at this time became really close with many of their Bengali friends and all sorts of different people here. They learned to love East Pakistan and to understand its struggle for independence. But what transformed them from, you know, run-of-the-mill ordinary foreigners to activists in support of Bangladesh was the Cyclone Polar, November 1970, which killed many hundreds of thousands of people in a single night. And this group of Americans associated with the Cholera Research Laboratory were very much involved in the response to that cyclone and providing humanitarian aid. So these are several photographs that some of them took when they were providing some of that relief. There's John and Candy Rodi, two of the associates of the Cholera Research Laboratory, and you see pinned to John's lapel there as HELP, which was the name of their organization, the Hatia Emergency Life Project, because they were based near Hatia and on Monpura Island. Just a few more photos. And one of the things they first sort of described was the Cyclone Syndrome, which is the result of people attempting to hold on to trees despite the extremely high winds. When they were there, they met people who are very famous to Bangladesh, and, you know, students of Bangladeshi history will well know Father Richard Tim. They'll know the late and great Sir Fazli Hassan Abed as well, who are all involved in these Americans' efforts as well, providing relief to cyclone victims. And in providing relief, and, you know, in those most turbulent months towards the end of 1970 and the beginning of 1971, the members of the Cholera Research Laboratory and this group of Americans became increasingly involved in an understanding of and sympathetic towards Bangladesh's struggle for freedom before Operation Searchlight. And when Operation Searchlight did in fact take place, they themselves found themselves, you know, surrounded by a campaign of unfolding terror. Many of them at that time lived in Gulshan. And the military crackdown provoked a mixture of outrage and determination. They watched American-made tanks rolling through the streets, flames and smoke engulfing much of the city. And when they were allowed to, when the curfew was lifted, they spent as much time as they could documenting what was happening. And they, traveled to the universities and saw, blood-soaked dormitories. They traveled to the Ramna Kali Mandir and, saw the killings that had taken place there and Shankari Bazaar and places like that. And many of them were evacuated to Tehran, something chronicled in Archer Blood's book. And they immediately started to write home. And at a time where, again, speaking to your point, Patrick, the mass crimes were taking place in darkness in an era of even less mass communication, or less mass communication than now. These sorts of letters and these communications were actually key, first-hand communications from, respectable American citizens were very, very useful. And the people who were receiving them back home were former colleagues from the Cholera Research Lab and other associates who took this information and built an organization to deliver it to Congress and to deliver it to sympathetic congressmen and senators who could hopefully, in their view, press the Nixon government to change its policies and stop supporting Pakistan. The lady just in the middle there, Anna Braun Taylor, who had lived in East Pakistan in the late 1960s, wrote this moving document, which I obviously will not read in full, but she talked about coming here to outside the White House to mourn for the living and not for the dead. So not for the people who had already died, but for the people who were in power who continued to fail to act. And she asked the passers-by that day to mourn with her. And this is Anna, and David Nayland, a doctor from the Cholera Lab, talking to a journalist just behind there at one of their demonstrations. But the real focus for this group of activists, who were one of many, and I'll speak to the many other Bengali groups who were involved shortly, but this group of activists really honed in on influencing Congress as the thing that they thought they should do. While they were obviously supportive of the independence struggle, that they weren't looking to pick up arms and go and join the fight. They were looking at ways that they could minimize the United States' very negative role in this conflict, because at that time the United States, as many historians have chronicled, was providing extremely large amounts of military and economic assistance to Pakistan, most if not all of which was being used to aid their violent suppression of the Bengali people. But one of the other things that this group was able to do throughout the course of their activities was to channel this flow of information from expatriate Americans still living in East Pakistan at the time back to the United States. This letter here comes from one of the doctors, Dr. Henry Mosley, who in this instance is chronicling a visit he took in May 71 to Nagori, just outside of Dhaka, where there is a Christian church, and many Hindus had fled to that Christian church to seek refuge. And he went for a visit there clandestinely, he was not supposed to, and he took many photographs of people, homes destroyed in the villages around Nagori, of refugees and huddled masses, absolutely fearful for their lives, and was relaying this information. And so what I've tried to do in my book, which is coming out shortly, I'll talk about at the end, is channel some of these flows of information and look at how source material like this actually made its way from, the villages of Nagori all the way to the halls of power in Washington, and what, if anything, happened when it got there. Other people like Father Richard Tim, were also sending information all throughout the war, testifying to what was happening in Dhaka at that time. And it's hard to stress how important this information was, especially for Congress and for people like Edward Kennedy, who this group was regularly briefing, because Edward Kennedy did not have access to all of the information that, say, Richard Nixon had. We can think of the United States government as a whole, but different parts of it have different amounts of information. So Nixon and Kissinger may have known very well what was going on the ground, but for people like Frank Church, for people like Edward Kennedy, they relied on third parties to some degree to help brief them. So evidence like this was extremely important. Here's just a wee look inside one of the Bangladesh Information Centre's offices, which included many Americans who were very interested. Many joined the cause beyond this group of doctors from the cholera lab over time. Some, like Kaiser Zaman, who's second from the left there, were refugees and was a refugee himself from East Pakistan, Bangladesh, to the United States during the war. It's a photo of them just welcoming another refugee for a magazine article. But they also worked with a lot of other Bangladeshi groups. And this is something I talk about more in the book, although the focus today is just on this one group. But F.R. Khan, the world famous architect and builder of the Sears Tower, founded the Bangladesh Defense League in Chicago, which people like Mohammed Yunus and Shamsul Bari worked for. In New York, the Bangladesh League of America, which was made up of the community of Bengali sailors and different people who lived in New York at that time, and was very, very active on the ground. And you can see a group of women here marching outside the United Nations. But the other thing that I try and chronicle in the book a little bit, and which I think is important to note here, is that in this argument over what was happening in East Pakistan, in the argument over, what position the United States...
1 minute.
1 minute, I've got it. And the argument over what shape this should take, the United States response should take, Pakistan was also running a very strong campaign. So this right here is a group of Pakistanis who are very, very active in protesting as well. So I'll skip through a whole lot of these and just get right to the very end. We know how the story ends. Just there, very famous photo, and Ted Kennedy going to visit Bangladesh. But there are a few conclusions. So this just really is to say that the information center that I talked about a bit in this presentation did impact how sympathetic US politicians approached the war, and the way they coordinated these lobbying efforts was very important in concert with other Bengali groups. And just speaking very specifically to the themes of this panel and this conference, I mean, I think this kind of work is very, very important because understanding the diasporic response to genocide, I think, is very helpful, and understanding how diasporas, can become active on behalf of their compatriots at home is a very, very important component of understanding, how you can raise awareness about genocides overseas, and understanding how empathy and sympathy about genocide is mobilized. Another thing that I would certainly want to just speak to is also understanding how activists use the language of genocide, how genocide was something that they could use to generate support from people like Edward Kennedy, and how easy or difficult it was to make those accusations. And to your point, Professor Islam, and to yours, Patrick, it was extremely difficult for these activists to convince people like Edward Kennedy that genocide had taken place. They were prepared to believe a lot, and they were prepared to be sympathetic to a lot, but because they couldn't prove that genocide was happening, it was very, very hard to convince them. And ultimately, the final thing I'll say is what this speaks to, and this sort of grassroots history speaks to what I hope for the future of, histories about the liberation war overseas, which is a greater emphasis on the people's history of the liberation struggle abroad. So thank you very much. Dhanyabad.
Dhanyabad. Samuel, excellent, Samuel. Thank you for bringing all those untold stories to our notice, and I'm sure that your publication will tell more about that, and it will reach to the greater audience. Now, we are almost at the end of our session. We have some 3-4 minutes to go to make some quick comments or any last observations. For example, I have got a question here. Surajit Roy Majumdar has written, taking clues from Professor Islam, my question is to all panelists, don't you think the term Hindu should be included in all official documents about Bangladesh genocide 1971? Aren't we giving a chance to some criminals to deny that Hindus and other minorities had the major share of sacrifice in 1971 and deny their place in national narrative by not by not officially recognized Hindu and minority sacrifices. Would any of you like to comment on this in a sentence or two? Sir.
Well, that's a political question, basically. In terms of law, what I can say, the two tribunals made it abundantly clear, and also if you read the report on Bangladesh massacre in 1971 by International Commission of Jurists, they made it abundantly clear that Hindus were the principal target of the occupation army, as well as the local auxiliary forces. Now, yes, from that point of view, legally it is well recognized that they were the target group, and whether in the political narratives and various other national documents, whether their sacrifice will be recorded, that's a totally different question, goes beyond legal recognition. But so far, legal recognition is concerned, it's well documented everywhere.
Thank you, sir. Monir Alam has thanked Patrick because he remembered that he participated in a workshop on the LWM on transitional justice. Thank you, Patrick. I have 2 minutes more. I will give 1 minute to Patrick and 1 minute to Samuel. Patrick, your last comment. You need to unmute yourself.
I just want to say I've worked in scores of transitions, and what I've found is that actually nobody knows the complete story of what happened everywhere. Many people think they do, but when a Truth and Reconciliation Commission goes out and seeks the story of every single victim, we find new massacres that we didn't know about. In fact, I've found sometimes massacres that have been reported in several times in history books didn't take place because of these issues. So these questions that have come up about what's true and what isn't true, it is a bit of a shame in some ways that it's 50 years after the 1971 genocide, and Bangladesh has not undertaken a full national process such as a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because the witnesses will not be with us forever. So I'll just leave it at that point, that nobody, in my experience, nobody actually knows what happened in every place across the country during that time. That's the sort of thing that a Truth Commission looks at.
Thank you, thank you. I'm overstepping time. Samuel, I will hear last one sentence from you before you take your flight.
Surely. Well, I think all I would say is that to anyone who is listening or watching, who are young, aspiring historians, I think I'd encourage them to take up Patrick's call to search for the truth, the Shotik Itihash, and to work as hard as they can to to gather evidence and preserve these stories while people are still here and we can still talk to them.
Thank you. Yeah, I echo your voice that we will strive to know the Shotik Itihash, the right history, and we'll enrich ourselves as well as inform the whole world about what happened here and elsewhere in other parts of the world. Dear audience, thank you so very much. Thank you, dear panelists, Professor Islam, Patrick, and Samuel, for taking part and contributing your wonderful thoughts with the audience. Thank you so very much. And with this note, I am taking off from this session and inviting you to other sessions of the day as well. Thank you so very much.